The first thing that we wanted to talk about this morning was some strategies we've been employing recently in South Carolina for dealing with abandoned and dilapidated buildings in our downtowns, which it's a tough nut to crack. I mean, we've been trying to work at this forever as Main Street architects. There's some really good websites. I'll send you some links. There's particularly some folks in Michigan who've done some really thoughtful, creative stuff about different approaches to minimum maintenance ordinances. Some of the ordinances, or I should say pieces of legislation we're working on in South Carolina, were also referenced from some really good ones in Texas. Texas probably has the most restrictive regulations. I'll send you those. But here's the bottom line. The good news that I can tell from Siloam Springs is thankfully this is not an issue you really have in droves. Is that a fair statement? I mean, I don't see just a whole ton of abandoned, dilapidated buildings. So you're blessed in that regard, but if you should in the future, hopefully this can help you. Now
we have a few key buildings
that need some things. Okay. Now, the way I structured this made some sense to me. I hope it makes some sense to you. And by the way, there's a handout in there. The article at the beginning is referenced at some point in the show, and then the individual slides are in the remaining pages. But kind of like our health, there's a reason why health companies or health insurance companies will pay you to go get a physical every year. Because it's just a hell of a, excuse me, I guess I'm not supposed to cuss in presentations. It's a heck of a lot cheaper to stay in good health than it is to have surgery to repair being in bad health. And so in my mind, when we talk about dilapidated and abandoned buildings, our best strategy is to never let them ever get there, okay? And so while our focus today is in these two columns, I want to real briefly ramp up from them because I think it'll show some typical recommendations that we make for Main Street and particularly design committees. You may have always asked the question, why do we do that? Well, hopefully the best one is building inventory. It'll make some sense when you see it in this context. Almost always think about it. If a building is in this category, how can we keep it there? If it gets to here, how can we move it back? And you constantly want to be moving your buildings from right to left. So I'm just going to unpack basically those points on the screen. And again, most of our conversation will concern these two categories. I'm going to go ahead and give you a definition, and then I'll explain in more detail later. But when I use the term dilapidated, the meaning kind of that goes companion to the legislation that we've forged in South Carolina is basically 5 years or less. Okay, in other words, it's been vacant for 5 years or less. I'm not going to split hairs about whether the ownership is local or absentee, but absentee ownership is often the hardest nut to crack of all. And that's what I've reserved for this last category of abandoned. It means it's been vacant for at least 5 years or more, and more times than not, but not always, the ownership is absentee-based, which just makes it a lot more difficult to deal with. All right, so in terms of occupied buildings, again, we're going to go pretty fast on this, but feel free to, since we got such a small crowd, just ask questions, do kind of a conversation-based thing. The first thing, of course, is just make sure we're doing regular maintenance. And again, this may be something long-term. Y'all may want to just publish a little, I know y'all published sort of an architectural character guide. Yeah, I can't wait to see it. But, it's amazing how many people just don't know how to take care of their building. And just give them the practical tips, of basically roofs and water are the key culprits. You just got to keep the water out of the building. It's the death knell of buildings. Matt probably knows better than anybody. But just the basics, touch pointing, touch-up painting, caulking, those kinds of things. When the building is occupied, believe it or not, is the best time to do the building inventory. Because if you don't do it then and you wait until it's vacant, then you're already at least 30 days behind the curveball in terms of marketing the building. So the reason we ask for you to do the building inventory, whether that's a ER committee or a design committee task, is because it prepares you just in case that particular building ever comes vacant. You can immediately start marketing it the very next day with all the details that are necessary, to help somebody make an informed decision about whether they want to lease, purchase, or occupy the building. And again, I know you all probably have models of these. I've got some models we're happy to share. You may have already done one. And of course, the big software package that's all the rage is Downtown Diva, which I think is one. You already have one? Cool.
We started working on this. We've just been getting info from the property data website. But, yeah, we need to talk about this maybe if we want to do that as a design committee or do our committee, because I just remember, we haven't had like a task force on it.
Yeah.
So,
No worries. And to be honest with you, don't repeat this out of this room unless you really like your ER committee. We often give it to the ER committee just because that seems to be the committee that struggles the hardest to find things to do. Whereas design committee, there's always kind of a high profile. And so we just give it to them, makes them feel whatever. So, again, I forget there's a number out there. I used to know it, but the amount of money that it takes to recruit a tenant, and especially a merchant, versus to retain them is like 5 to 1. And so when there's a valuable business in a building, you make them feel love, okay? Just appreciate them. And you do an e-newsletter, right?
yeah.
Just figure out ways to promote your merchants. I hear y'all got a great photographer in town. I forget his name. I'm just kidding, these guys. But just promoting your local businesses so they feel, honored and appreciated. Do y'all do any form of regular merchants meetings? Okay. Good for you. And can I just pry a little bit? Are those productive, or are they gripe sessions, or a little bit of both?
I think it's become really good. We could probably have a little more participation, but that functions as our promotions committee.
Oh, okay.
That's worked out really well for us because we keep it open so people can always come. So you don't have to like commit to doing a lot of work. But every time we have it, I send it out to all of the people downtown to say, if you want to come, so we'll talk about all the events coming up and time.
Yeah. Terrific. And I don't pick up on this vibe in Siloam, but in other places, there's almost this spirit of animosity. And if you have a merchants meeting, they're so antagonistic, and it's just a gripe session that people don't want to have them. But the reason I have this phrase, burp the baby, just letting them have an avenue to vent their concerns is sometimes more than half the battle. Sometimes you don't even have to do anything in response. They just want to know they've been heard. So that's why I encourage you to do those meetings. So kudos to you all. Most only do it once a quarter, once a month I do. All right, so the first strategy, again, the time to write or have your minimum maintenance ordinance adopted, again, is not when the buildings are vacant, but when they're occupied.
Yeah.
So that if they become occupied and are moving towards dilapidation, you've got some teeth already in place. Now, do you all know if the city has some form of a minimum maintenance ordinance in place?
I'm almost positive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not that I know
All right. Well,
of.
and that, yeah, and I'm going to address that in a subsequent phase because unless you think otherwise, that's the norm. And believe it or not, oftentimes it's not because the city's just a jerk either. I'm going to save that point for later. Okay, I'm going to talk about why it's so hard to enforce it in a later part of this presentation. But you at least ought to have it on the books so that when you start having these conversations with property owners, it's not your word against their word. There's some objective criteria why you're having that conversation with them.
Well, I mean, nice question.
Yeah.
We're talking specifically about buildings like in the historic district, right? Or are we talking about, because, I mean, obviously we have like, you keep your grass can't grow.
Right.
To, that.
Yeah.
Is that also considered a form of?
It is. Well, what is going to be contained in the city ordinance, Meredith, will be citywide. I think Main Street's purview, you should just worry about your district. You don't have to worry about, the cars in somebody's yard. That it really is a city function, or people have, rotten railroad ties in their backyard or things like that. That's a joke. The key thing is, even if you don't have one, what's that? That's right. Even if you don't have one locally, I'm willing to bet the farm that either the state has sort of an overarching one, and if not, they almost always are going to reference, I thought I had it in here, it's in another slide, there's an international property maintenance code, and I sent that to you. Let me just cut through the check. The equivalent of putting the Secretary of Standards in the front of your design guidelines. It's just a blanket coverall, just in case you don't have anything else. Ideally, you should craft an ordinance that's specific to your town and your issues. This is just an umbrella to cover you if you don't have one. Okay, now we're going to talk about facade grants after this in greater detail, correct? Okay, so for now, let this just kind of be a point. And a great time to do facade grants, again, is while the buildings are vacant. While they're occupied, even before they're vacant. And again, we'll talk about strategies later about whether you want to do an overall facade grant or component grants. And then I've got some other strategies for you as well, Meredith, including one based on a comment that Matt made earlier, that people in Iowa have done this pretty forward thinking. Okay, so once these buildings become vacant, then what do we do? Again, we've still got to do regular maintenance. The problem is the property owner tends to be a lot more lax once there's no one in the building because he's not getting any income. So it may take more conversations than it would otherwise. Something that I think is real important is what do we do if a building is vacant to make it at least not appear to be vacant, okay, in the short term. And so, especially knowing you've got photographers, artists, just see if the owner will at least be amenable to you putting artwork behind the storefront window so that, again, at least the appearance isn't of a vacant building. One of my favorites, this is up in Illinois, they just took probably a historic photograph or a postcard, and they just printed it out on plot paper, just white butcher paper, and just applied it into the backside of the windows. And that way, you're really kind of drawn to the nostalgic view, and you don't pay attention to the fact that the building's vacant. Greg and I were in Arkadelphia a couple of weeks ago. It was really cute because a couple came up to me when I showed this image, and they said, "So how do you affix that to the inside of the window?" I said, "You take tape and you put it in this corner and that corner." It's not really hard. What's that? Okay, I'm going to show what we did in Arkadelphia for that pharmacy in the second presentation, but I'll go ahead and mention it. In Arkadelphia, they had this one particular business. The building was completely occupied and running this amazing pharmacy, but because so many of their procedures and kind of computers were proprietary, they couldn't allow the public to see inside. The problem was we couldn't do this either because they had built a wall right up on the back side of the window. So the only way you could have done this, you would have literally had to remove the frames, put it on the back side, put it back in, which no one was going to do in their right mind. And so the solution we came up there, and again, I'll show you the rendering in the next presentation, is basically to do the vinyl car wraps and print it on that, and then just affix the vinyl to the window itself. But it was amazing. The crowd, it was such a simple rendering, and they got so excited because I should have mentioned the building is a half block long. So you take a half block worth of blank windows, it looks like the town's boarded up. But it wasn't. This is one of my favorite ones, and of course, y'all could do a killer version of this, given the people and the stories and the photography that y'all could procure. But in Conway, South Carolina, where I'm from, we just did these really simple 11 by 17, so you can print it on your own color laser jet. I Am Conway campaigns, and it just featured different people. I mean, this guy is, I guess, kind of sort of important. He's a city manager, but everybody else, like this lady's a tailor. This guy makes mandolins. They just have a one-sentence statement about either what they love about Conway or why they call it home. And so what you find yourself doing is you want to read about your friends and your neighbors, forgotten that the building behind it is vacant, because you're just so drawn to read their stories. So that's a pretty good strategy to just kind of mitigate the appearance of a vacant building being too empty. Of course, if it is empty, then you need to do recruitment. Of course, I'm not limiting it to retail. It's just that's the term we normally use. Have you all done some form of a market analysis? Okay. Well, and again, the only benefit in it is thoughtfulness about what type of retail you're going to recruit. Ideally, what I see happen so often in our small towns. We'll just take this storefront right here, for example. So a business moves in, they fail. Another business moves in, they fail. And all of a sudden, the downtown gets a reputation as being bad for business. No, I mean, there could be 1,000 reasons why the business went out of business. But the key is, are you putting in a use that your market can support? And so that'll at least give you some objective criteria for recruitment. It doesn't guarantee anything because the business owners might have the perfect business for the market, but if they don't have the right price point, if their hours aren't right, if they're just jerks, there's a lot of reasons why businesses fail. But I'm a really big fan on. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I hear the term market analysis a lot.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Sure.
How affordable does that have to be to be considered?
How affordable?
How formal?
Formal. Oh, not formal at all. Well, first of all, there are a couple different types. You can do kind of a drive time based. You can do a zip code based, or you can do. Did I say zip code already?
I mean, we have like the S3 data sheet.
Yeah.
That we look at a lot. So I tend to think that like we're trying to do that, but.
That's not bad. Yeah. Drive time and zip code is all you need for either an Esri or a Claritas report, and that on the scale of bad to awesome. That's basically in the good range, because that'll at least put you in the ballpark. But if you want a little bit more specificity and a little bit more confidence, you're really dialing it in. The zip code survey is your best instrument. Like tomorrow, I'm going to feature Pascagoula, Mississippi in a talk I'm doing, and you had to do a zip code survey. Zip code survey there. Yeah, let me back up. There's a zip code survey, and then you can just pick a zip code. What's your zip code here?
727.
Okay. So that's one way you can do it, is you can just enter that zip code in Claritas Israel's report. That's not enough. A zip code survey is everybody who goes to one of these merchants for a 1 week period. You've done this, you've checked out and said, do you mind if I get your zip code? That's what they're doing. And when you do that, then you have a lot more specificity about the people who are coming. And what it's really helpful is if it's a non-local zip code and you can see it popping up in different stores, then you can sort of track their sort of browsing patterns. Pascagoula, Mississippi is surrounded on three sides by water. A drive time and a zip code alone is not going to help you because shrimp don't shop. Okay. And so you need a zip code survey so that you're actually tracking human beings that are in your town, because that's the best market. But in y'all's case, you absolutely must have a community survey to supplement it. It's mostly because the students at JBU are going to skew every one of your numbers. And by the way, typically they're going to skew them in a good way, because I guarantee you, for all of you who pay tuition there, it ain't cheap. And so you probably, especially if they're using mom and dad's credit cards, you probably have a higher level of disposable income than actually somebody just a local would have. But back to your original question, in terms of the degree and the value, it is not that expensive. I mean, you get a quality one done for 6 to 8, 10 at the most, 1,000. And especially if you can get like the city, and if do you have an economic development entity with either the city or the county? Okay. Because sometimes what you can do is you have to go in together and get it done. But I'm telling you straight up, the key is interpretation. Okay, a market analysis is just numbers. It's just data. The magic is having somebody who can translate that into practical English and tell you what markets you ought to pursue. Now, I'm going to show my hand only because I've done 200 communities with them, but Arnett Muldrow does an amazing job. But I'm sure there are many, many other firms who could do an equally good job. The reason I like them, I'm a creative. I break out in hives over a spreadsheet. They actually take that data and use words that I understand, which is saying something. So, did that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely.
Was it too much? Okay.
No, it's good, because we talked a lot about it, we wanted to do it,
Yeah.
and all that, so it's just good to hear.
And I tell you what, it's valuable beyond just retail recruitment. I know you're working on the library. That's kind of an anomaly, but other infill buildings, especially if a master plan is calling for infill construction, it's got to be rooted in some economic development criteria. You just don't build a building for the sake of building a building. So that's the other thing that's helpful. I have no qualms that you guys wouldn't have quality materials, but let's say recruitment trips. Well, y'all did a great example of this. 28 Springs is a great example, okay? You went to somebody who already had an established restaurant, a quality chef, and you said, hey, how would you be interested in relocating here? You use the exact same approach for retail. You find a use that you can support. If somebody knows of somebody in a nearby town who's already doing it successfully, ask them if they want to open up a branch here. Now, the key is, ideally, you've got a companion set of financial incentives that you and the city work together on that kind of sweetens the pot. So you don't just show up. It's not enough just to show up with a sexy brochure, okay? I mean, but that's helpful, by the way. It helps more than just going and saying, hey, would you please come to Siloam Springs? Put something attractive in their hands, and then if you can companion it with some incentives, whether it's, anything on that list, that's a good thing. I meant to look up, we got a town here in South Carolina called Spartanburg, and they came out with an amazing rent subsidy program, and I'll dig up and send you the link. But I want to say it's like $12,000. It's like $1,000 per month after you've been in business for. It's ridiculous. Or maybe it's just 1,000, but I mean it's enough to move somebody off center to do something. That's how significant it is. Let me pick up again. We're going to talk about this in greater detail when we talk about the facade approaches. So let's just skip that for now. That's okay. Okay. So now we're getting to the heart and the core of why we're here this morning. So the first is dilapidated buildings. Again, my definition: vacant for 5 years or less. Ownership doesn't matter. It's just this is a vacant building. It's clear the owner's not going to want to do anything. So what can we do here? Well, unfortunately, before all we had to do was do remedial maintenance. Now we got to do something a little bit more difficult, because I got to be the first one to tell you, the longer a building sits, the worse things happen. And so the only point I'm making here that's different than remedial maintenance is understand the issues become a lot more difficult in nature and difficult to remedy. Now what was before just as a leak is becoming a structural problem. What was before just a little bit of wet brick, now we're starting to get spalling and separations. And so the building doctor is just a technique that your SHPO, I don't know if yours has it, but they just it's a list of common things that occur to buildings when they sit vacant as sort of a checklist, which gives you then what you need to do to fix it. And unfortunately now it's not just a matter of popping on a piece of flashing or painting some brick. Now we've got to fix the crap that's occurred because we've had water infiltration, not for just a day or a month, but for years. And again, it's, yeah.
Excuse me, are you saying, back to that slide, are you saying that then for every vacant building that you have, it's part of some sort of assessment?
No, what I'm saying is, if you have a building that's been sitting vacant for years, you're going to have to do a level of study and analysis of what needs to be fixed. That's beyond just doing regular maintenance.
It doesn't
Exactly, exactly. And then if you find that degradation has occurred, the remedy now is a lot more expensive and difficult than it would have been if you just stayed on top of it.
We consider that photo there.
Was a,
Pretty good safety problem.
Is that?
a pretty good.
Should
Should
be,
be,
should
should
be
be
up
up
on
on
that
that
one
one
right there.
No, that's probably a good photo for that then.
Don't do that.
I've been pleasantly surprised by how often, DFR is my term for digital facade rendering. You know, I obviously do Photoshop before and afters. What I've noticed occasionally is sometimes the reason the building is set vacant is because people can't see the potential. But if you show them a rendering, sometimes it's like, oh, okay, I'm willing to go the extra mile. And of course, my favorite case study of all time is this one that really happened. The other point I make about this building is sometimes we jump to conclusions about the character of the person who owns this building. You know, what a jerk who let their building. But in this case, that's not always the case. He was an older gentleman who acquired it later in life, and he was just scared. He didn't know how difficult it would be to remove this metal slip cover, how much it would cost, what he would find if he pulled it off. The nice thing, and Matt, you can see here, they've got furring strips, and oftentimes what they used to do with these buildings is they would literally shear off any of the masonry that projects so they could just have a real simple metal slip cover. Here they didn't do that. And so when this kind old man brought me up on the second floor, I was like, that's crazy, because all the windows were still there. Everything was still there. And because of the way they had fixed it to the furring strips, I knew it was just a simple some screws, and so he couldn't stay with me. By the way, this was one of those digital design charrettes I talked to you about.
Oh, okay.
And so I met with him at about, 11:30, and so by 2 o'clock, I called him back. He couldn't stay with me. He had to go to lunch. I said, well, I think the building's going to look like this. And this was back when I wasn't really good at Photoshop, so this is kind of a rough rendering. But the best news is it looked even better. But here's what gets really good, and again, we'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we talk about facades and grants and incentives. But the cool part of this story was the city realized the cost for removing and disposing of that slipcover is about $900 and some change. And so the city issued a one-time, one-year grant for slipcover removal, up to $1,000 a piece. And as a result, 5 out of the remaining 6 buildings pulled off their slipcovers. So, but that story gets told in the next presentation. But again, sometimes a lot of people, they just can't see it until you show them the picture, and then they may take action. And especially since you've got access to this via Arkansas Main Street, by all means, take advantage of it. Okay, so here we are. Now we're back to minimum maintenance ordinances, because I told you make sure you write one when the buildings are vacant. So now they're dilapidated. So our knee-jerk reaction is what? The dang city won't enforce it. It's on the books. Well, and there's a reason why it's hard. And the reason is the people that own those buildings probably go to church with you or shop with you or go to, their kids go to school with your kids. And so, first of all, it takes some political will, if you will, to go up against your friends and neighbors. It's just awkward. But here's the bigger issue. It takes money. To go and clean up the debris, or to haul off the car, or to repair the roof, or to board up the doors and windows, takes money and manpower. And unless Siloam is the exception, a lot of cities don't budget extra money just for minimum maintenance enforcement. Now, some will have some, but I'm telling you, if the cities fixed up every delinquent property that existed in their boundaries, they would all go broke. Trust me, I am not defending cities who aren't doing their job. I'm just saying that's the reason why this doesn't happen. First, it's just the political will of dealing with your friends. Some of the strategies to employ are in that article, and we're going to talk about them right now. Again, one of the incentives that you can use and suggest, especially if it's a historic building, which typically in your Main Street districts, most of these are going to qualify, is make sure these owners sitting on dilapidated buildings understand, if possible, they can qualify for, in your case, since y'all have a matching 25%, up to 45% federal tax credits, which is huge, absolutely huge. Again, I say South Carolina, but Arkansas has the exact same matching grant. Are y'all familiar with tax credits? Do I need to say anything more than what I've just said? Perfect. Good.
I'd like to open up a big discussion. What is a historic structure? Is it in the historic register or district? Is that what that's referring
There's a lot of criteria. One has to do with its age. 50 years or more is cut. That automatically, the technical term is period on the walls at least that long. The other is if some historic event occurred there, or if the architecture or the architect was of some. But if it resides within a district as a contributing structure, that qualifies it as well. Anything you want to add or take away from my answer? It's a good question. Really good question, actually. We didn't know, when I say we, I asked Greg and Susan, we don't know the answer to this question in Arkansas. But in South Carolina, they created about 10 years ago an ordinance. Technically, it would be a tax abatement ordinance. But since the senator who nominated was Mr. Bailey, everybody just refers to it as the Bailey bill. And if the state of Arkansas does not have this, you should absolutely lobby for it yesterday. And again, when I say you, go to your what do you call your legal cities or municipal league?
Arkansas Municipal League.
Okay. They would be a wonderful advocate for this if you don't have it already. But what this strategy does is, so let's say Dave's automobile shop across the way. They hire Matt to do, a rehab. They decide they want to do tax credits. And let's just say Dave's sitting there right now, I'm just going to throw out a real easy math number for me, is worth $100,000. But once Matt and Ron do their magic on the building, it's now worth $250,000. Well, it's kind of counterproductive to day one charging Dave a tax bill based on $250,000. It's like, good grief, I just fixed up my building and now I'm having to pay a price. That doesn't make sense. And so what this bill does is it freezes the property tax value at the pre-improved state for a predetermined amount of time. It can be up to 20 years. Typically, it's not that long. Typically, it's 5, 10, or 15. But that just makes all the sense in the world. You shouldn't penalize people for fixing up their buildings. And in absence of that, it's very counterproductive. I mean, it's one of those things. It's like, that makes all the sense in the world. So check and see if you have it, and if not, I definitely think Arkansas Main Street and the League of Cities, it's something you should definitely advocate for. Okay. I sent Megan all of these bills. Well, first of all, let me just, recently James Smith introduced a bill. This was adopted, I think, a year or two ago. And because I love you guys, I'm going to be honest with you. On one hand, this is a good bill, but it ain't a great bill. Basically, it allows cities on a sliding scale, in addition to everything else we've talked about so far, tax credits and tax abatement, it allows them to give local tax credits on a sliding scale based on population. Forget everything I just said, and let me simplify it and tell you this. This is basically tax credits without the Secretary's standards. And that's why it's good, but it ain't great. Because frankly, I don't want people to benefit from tax credits if they aren't going to do the right thing from a design point of view. If you don't have anything, this is better than nothing. All right, so now we get to the hardest, and that's these abandoned buildings that have sat so long. Again, my definition is 5 or more years. often but not always with an absentee landlord that makes it really difficult to do something. And why are these so tough? Well, first of all, the problem we have is not only is the value of that building declining, but so are the ones beside it. And I've seen this firsthand, and especially in larger urban communities, not so much in small ones, but in urban ones. This whole notion of illegal activity, it's incredible how these buildings become magnets for just the worst kind of human behavior. And once it starts, then it just kind of spreads. And it's just amazing. It's almost akin to a cancer, if you will. And what makes it so hard to fix, especially if you've got an absentee landlord, is they don't live in your town. They don't see how crappy their building looks. And so they don't care. And here's the problem. They've gotten so accustomed to not drawing rent from the building, they're like, why should I invest money in a building that's just sitting there vacant? And so it becomes this sort of cyclical problem. And again, all of these other things, and again, if your local community doesn't have regulations to help, it's just going to exacerbate, okay? And we've already talked about the fact that even if you have them on the books, that doesn't get you in the clear, because you have to have, well, I shouldn't say it that way. I was going to say have something to enforce it. You have to have the political will to enforce it, but you also might have to have the financial resources to address the problem. So what the state of South Carolina did, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. If your SHPO has any remaining stabilization and weatherization grants, that's the first thing to do is it's just kind of, I know it's a, hey, how you doing?
Good.
Hey, what's your name?
Mike.
Okay. I'm just keeping track of everybody. Nice to meet you, Mike.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. Are you on the design committee?
I guess I am.
Awesome.
He was, and then he had to forcing him to be on the design committee.
And what's Mike's last name?
Butler.
Well, welcome, Mike. It's good to have you with us today. So the first thing is just somehow by hook or crook, scraping pennies, at least stabilize and weatherize the buildings to prevent any further damage from being done. I don't know what the state of Arkansas SHPO is, but South Carolina, we're out of money. It used to be that this was one of the few grants that they would offer every year because it was so critical. Because it's basically a stopgap. It is simply and only putting a Band-Aid on a huge wound, but at least it stopped the wound from getting worse infected.
Did you say SHPO?
SHPO, S-H-P-O, the State Historic Preservation Office.
That's our office.
Cool. Got it.
AHPP is the SHPO. It's an HHPO.
Yeah.
I
I
government
Why?
works.
Preservation.
Officer.
My apologies, yeah. And see, I used to pronounce it SHPO because I thought it sounded French and nicer. But it's SHPO. Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, if
Now
I,
we're in
on the lingo, yeah. So. Okay, the picture on the right has nothing to do with the text on the left. I just thought it was a humorous photograph. So anyway, have y'all ever heard of or gone through the Don Ripkema Community Initiated Development Workshop? Okay. Well, first of all, Donovan, if you don't know him, he's kind of legend in Main Street circles. He's just a brilliant man out of D.C. Specializes in economic development, but from a historic preservation perspective. And he kind of coined this term. And by the way, you can buy his workbook and workshop on Amazon. And the first thing I'll say before I go to the details, this is not impossible, but it's not easy. But here's the good news for Siloam. Y'all are a rare exception because you got people like Matt, you got people like Ron, you got the Simmons. Because typically what a community-initiated development does is it works with these strategic partnerships where you basically create an investment group to redevelop a building. And ideally what you do is you create this investment pool comprised of people who have expertise, ideally in design, construction, somebody who has money, and out like Main Street, a nonprofit. And so you you can wheel the deals and the grants and the tax credits to get them to the parties who can take advantage of tax credits, whereas Main Street can, so you sell those off. And basically, by the time it's all done, every party brings their expertise to bear on the problem, and you basically redevelop this building of your own initiative. But it's not easy. And so, but it is a good strategy to employ. Basically, you're asking permission of the property owner and say, we'll take the property and we'll do this for you. Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. But this is probably, again, tax credits is a good strategy to employ here. And this is the one that I think has a lot of merit.
Let me go back. You're talking about taking that team. I mean, that team has worked here, but one of the team members has had the investment.
Correct.
You're talking about taking that team and then identifying somebody and approaching them.
Correct.
It's a little bit different deal.
Yeah, it's difficult because they may say no. You know, in other words, there still has to be a real estate transaction for that to occur.
Are you talking about buying for funding, or are you talking about?
Yeah, basically, you take a white elephant building that's been sitting vacant in your town forever, and you approach the property owner and say, we want to purchase the building. Oh, is that the deco one that I like so much?
No.
Okay, the theater.
It's the one with green shag carpet.
Oh, yum.
Yeah, by the
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Well, so that's the trick right now is that we have these buildings, but several of the property owners are like, oh, all this great stuff is happening now, my building's worth a lot more, and I'm like, not really.
So they have a false sense of entitlement because
Yeah.
everybody else is enhanced their knowledge. Yeah, so basically, great question, Matt. What I'm about to talk about is the two sides of that coin. This one is going to talk about ways to fix up a building that you don't own. Okay? Whereas the other one was, there has to be a property transaction first. The only difference is we aren't asking the traditional developer to do it on their own. We're saying, we're going to take, as kind of a bunch of friends and neighbors, we're going to do it as a group. Okay? I'm not saying you can't do it in the traditional model. It's just, it's a different approach or an additional approach rather than run by all the properties. This to me is brilliance. And again, the one that's been on the books the longest and the most restrictive of these abandoned building acts comes from the state of Texas. And I bet we could talk to Sarah Blankenship. She's my counterpart. She's the architect for it. And she probably could dig it up for us. Patient with me, because this is a little bit detailed. I need to work through every one of these points. All right? Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to come here and then I'm going to go back. The problem with these historically is being in the South, we are staunch property rights people. Can they get an amen? Okay, it's like, I'll be damned if you can do that to my property. Well, and so when cities historically, when we talked about enforcing these minimum maintenance ordinances, and especially eminent domain or demolition by neglect, it just opens up this huge legal can of worms because basically it's a form of takings, okay? Now, we would all, from our perspective, say, but it's a good form of takings because the building in its current state harm. It's a life safety issue and things of that nature. So what this does is, before we get to that point, the city has to first try everything in its power to remedy the problem in a traditional way. Letters, fines, enforcing minimum maintenance ordinances. But if all of those things don't work, are y'all starting to get cold or do y'all feel okay? I just noticed it. Everybody get okay? I'll double that a little bit. I just noticed everybody starting to shiver. So what we're going to do, what this strategy employs is the concept of receivership as opposed to takings. And so what happens, so the city, what's the name of the building with the shag carpet? Okay. So he goes to a court and says, look, no matter what we've tried, the AP building and the owners, and we're about to have some serious life safety issues. The roof's about to fall in. You know, there's probably some structural degradation. We need to do something. We've tried finding them. We've tried minimum maintenance. We've tried this. Okay, and so they appeal to the court and they say, we would like to place this building in receivership. And the receivership becomes this entity. Now, the entity could be public, private, it could be an individual, it could be a group, it could be a construction firm, it could be an architecture. It doesn't matter. It's just the receiver comes to the city and says, we will, on your behalf, fix up the building. And so there's a plan laid out, and they say, we will do this for the building, this for the building, this for the building, this for the building. We think it's going to cost X. And so the city goes to the court and says, we need to place this building in receivership so this remedial work can be done to it. And if the court agrees, that building, at that moment, believe it or not, becomes the property of the receivership. Now, here's the good news, and this is how it gets around eminent domain and takings. The property owner, the original property owner, at any point in this process, has the right and the freedom to take it back. Okay? So, at the moment that the city appeals to the court, the property owner can show up and say, yeah, they're right, I've been a jerk. I'm going to fix it up. And so at that point, instead of it going into receivership, coming in, it remains with the property owner. Hey, come on in. If the contractor begins the work, and let's say they're 25% down the road, 50% down the road, at any point along the way, the property owner can say, wow, now that I see the roofs on the building and the shingles have been taken off the front side, it looks better than I thought, I want to take it back. They can take it back there. The only difference is they also have to reimburse the receiver for whatever money they put in, which is fair. They would have to do it anyway. You can take it all the way to the end. So now let's go all the way to the forecast to the very end. And now the building is completely redone. And by the way, you can even occupy the building while it's in receivership. Okay? It's conceivable. You can not only fix up the building, you can actually lease it out and put tenants in there. A fully functioning building that's still in receivership. And so at the end of the predetermined period that the city appeals to the court for, typically it's 5 years, the owner then, beginning, middle, ending, now at the end says, you know what? I love what you've done to the building. It's fully occupied. I want my building back. Of course, you're smart people. The court says, not a problem. We need X amount of dollars to cover all of the cost of the repairs that have led to you having a fully restored building. And as long as he restores it, he gets the building back. And again, that's how this building gets around this really cantankerous notion of eminent domain and takings. But what happens if all of that is done, and even at the end, the property owner says, I just can't deal with it. I can't afford to reimburse the receiver. Well, at that point, the building goes to auction. Okay. And the lowest bid allowed, obviously, is the amount of the repairs plus a predetermined percentage of overhead and profit for the receiver. Typically, it's going to be 5 to 10%, typically 10%. That's the lowest bid possible. It can go up higher. And that way, we ensure that the receiver is always made whole. Okay? Hopefully, the receiver is going to get the building, but even if they don't, they get 100% of their investment plus a percentage to make it happen. To me, because it's the best of both worlds. It's a motivator for the local government and the property owner to maintain their buildings. If drastic measures need to take place to remove the building temporarily from their position to fix it, we never remove the right for them to take it back. So they can't argue that the city stole my building from them. But the benefit is you can empower people with the wherewithal to fix up the building to do so. That was a lot of words. Any questions you have about this?
Do you maintain or do you appraise it at the beginning so that if it is auctioned off, the owner will get that value at the end, the original value, or does he waive all of that altogether?
Truthfully, Matt, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a great question.
You would need to have
Yeah.
that.
Let me make a note, and I'll get you an answer. because my contact with the municipal league, who's spearheading this legislation, he'll get back to me. So the question was,
Because in essence, the receivership,
yeah,
if they, it seems like it ought to be the cost of remodeling plus a percentage plus the original cost.
mm-hmm,
Should be what it is.
plus the original value.
Just like you're gonna do it if you invest, you're buying the building as is. And then you're,
Tricky, right, because the rates were less than their rates, or, times.
Question.
but that is, I mean, in a sense, the receivership can kind of just look and grab it.
Right, right. And that's why it's such a and that's why this first bullet point is a key, because I promise you, if you go to court and say, hey, you want to do the AP building, he's going to say, well, have you done this, this, and this? And if you haven't, he's going to say, come back and see me later.
Well, that's part of the problem with some of these buildings, they're not falling down yet.
Yeah.
They're in that in between stage.
Yeah.
They're just abandoned, and they're dilapidated.
Dilapidated,
not
yeah.
abandoned.
Yeah, and that's where, honestly, Main Street could be a really good force, because y'all may be the voice of reason to them that the city can't be, because the city's just going to come in with a heavy hand. Try to figure out the ways to motivate them other than legislation to fix up their buildings.
And that's where it seems like